Thank you.
Okay, I think we're recording now. Okay, so can you just both of you, first of all, for everyone watching, thank you so much for joining. My name is Mahpara Qadri. I lead the campaign Mehfooz, which works with Adil or Sehat to create awareness about domestic violence laws. And we're working towards implementation of domestic violence laws as well as enabling people to understand how they can access competent legal aid. We have two incredible women here talking about domestic violence laws in Pakistan and the UK as well. Can each of you briefly describe your professional background and the main focus of your work regarding gender-based violence law and domestic violence law?
I think I'll go first. My name is Hania, and I work as a lawyer here in Lahore. My areas of practice include family law, constitutional and human rights for vulnerable segments of the population. Along with that, I'm associated with Adil Sehat since 2021. I initially joined Adil Sehat's fellowship program, later joined Legislation and Policy Clinic of Adil Sehat. And then I've also worked with the Legal Aid Bureau. The Legal Aid Bureau is a sub-project of Adil Sehat, which is dedicated to providing legal aid and support to vulnerable segments of the population. We have provided legal aid to scores of women who could not afford quality legal assistance. So we've helped them file cases of domestic violence, dissolution of Muslim marriage, dissolution of Christian marriages. We've also done cases pertaining to custody and guardianship. So that is what basically I've been working on along with my areas of practice. I also teach law. So I think that's all from my side, and maybe you can have Nailah.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Well, firstly, Mahpara, thank you for having me on board. It's a privilege to be taking part in this. I hope you can still see and hear me properly.
Yeah.
Thank you. So obviously, Mahpara, as you know, I'm a solicitor specializing in family law based in the UK and specifically in England. In England, well, in the United Kingdom, we have different jurisdictions. So I practice in England and Wales. I specialize in particular in children law, and I have mostly been working since qualification in 2016 in private practice. So I have done a range of family work, matrimonial, private law children, injunctions, domestic abuse, and public law care proceedings. However, since last year in January, I have been working with a charity called NYAS, which stands for the National Youth Advocacy Service. They are based in the north of England. And at the moment, since then, I have been specifically been representing children in private law disputes between parents and representing them as their voice and representing their interests. And I take instructions from the NIAS caseworkers and who put forward independent recommendations before the court. So that's, in a nutshell, that's where my experience comes from.
That's great. Sounds really rewarding, both of you. So since our focus with Mehfooz is mainly domestic violence and also under the ambit of gender-based violence, how do you think, Nailah, is gender-based violence or domestic violence addressed in the legal framework in England and Wales?
Yes, thank you. I took a look at that question, Mahpara, and I know the third question on your list of topics for today looks at the mechanisms and the protections which are available. I think my answer to this question is going to overlap between the two, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Yeah, definitely.
So in terms of the remedies, and I'm sorry, I'm just looking down because I'm just looking down at my notes. The remedies for domestic violence, obviously in the United Kingdom, or as I said, in England and Wales, where I practice, come from a range of different protections. So we have civil protection, we have the criminal protection. I will obviously be speaking from the perspective of family law, as that's my area of specialism. But there are overlaps of information and overlaps of disclosure sharing across these areas. And quite often that is what you see on a case-to-case basis. So given the time constraints that we have, it's naturally not possible for me to go into depth or to consider all of the different provisions, but I would like to focus on two of the main pieces of legislation, statute law. The first is the Family Law Act 1996. And this, sorry, just bear with me, my screen has gone. Sorry, just bear with me, I'm having technical difficulties. Here we go. So the first legislation which I wanted to focus on was the Family Law Act 1996. And this provides protection by way of civil injunctions, such as non-molestation orders or occupation orders in relation to a property where typically it is a husband and wife situation or cohabitees, whether that property is owned or rented. And those are the provisions which offer protection. These are commonly sought after protections, and they can often run parallel to other proceedings such as divorce, financial or children matters. In terms of non-molestation orders or occupation orders to protect the interests of the property or home for the victim, legal aid is available for these. And I know Hania touched on legal aid, and hopefully as we go through this discussion, we can come back to that and how that is available. The second legislation, which is more recent, is the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. Now, that has been instrumental in strengthening the provisions and protections for victims of domestic abuse, but also establishing new things. So for the first time, we have seen a legal definition of domestic abuse, which is now set down in statute. We have the role of domestic abuse commissioner established. There is now a duty on councils or local authorities to fund support for survivors in safe accommodation. There have been protections in family and civil courts for survivors. For example, there is now a prohibition on cross-examination. So a perpetrator or an alleged perpetrator of domestic abuse cannot cross-examine a victim of domestic abuse. And there has also been new criminal offences introduced as a result of this legislation, which includes non-fatal strangulation and post-separation coercive control, which have been, like I say, instrumental in strengthening matters across the board.
Yeah, that sounds pretty comprehensive. Hania, would you like to go ahead and talk a little bit about the Pakistani legal framework?
Perfect. So, Mahpara, the key legislation that we have in Pakistan that deals with the issue of domestic I'm sorry, am I audible?
Your voice broke in the middle, but now you are. I think we're ready to go again.
Perfect. So as I was saying, that the key legislation that we have in Pakistan pertaining to domestic violence is the Domestic Violence Act of 2013. Each province of ours has a separate its own law. Punjab has its own law, and Sindh has its own law on domestic violence. Section 5 of the Domestic Violence Act of 2013 basically gives us a comprehensive definition of what can count as domestic violence. So if we look at the act, not just acts of physical abuse like criminal force, criminal intimidation are recognized as domestic violence, then law goes ahead to include emotional abuse, psychological abuse. It also includes a provision for economic abuse and sexual abuse. So let's see what these different forms of abuse are that have been postulated under this law. Emotional, psychological, and verbal abuse has also been categorized to include a lot of different offenses like obsessive possessiveness, insults, ridiculing, threats to cause physical pain, blaming a spouse of immorality. So these are the different sort of offenses that have been recognized under the Domestic Violence Act. So if a person in a relationship, so one thing that I would also like to clarify here regarding the Domestic Violence Act of 2013, that is the domestic relationship. So it's not just that this act recognizes acts of violence committed by a husband against a wife. This act also extends to include other relations in the domestic context, like kinship, like adoption, like generally if you're living together in a household, tied by some sort of relationship, then this law is going to extend to you. It recognizes, as I said, physical abuse. So if you've been a victim of physical abuse, the offense is going to be punishable either under the penal code. So you can actually go and consult the police and file an FIR. So if you've been a victim of physical abuse, this act provides an avenue to get an FIR registered under the Pakistan Penal Code, depending on which section of the Pakistan Penal Code has been invoked on the fact. But if you've undergone abuse like economic abuse, which is that the respondent or anybody who is in that domestic relationship was obstructing you from economically progressing or was taking away your economic freedom, there you can file a complaint of domestic violence with the family court. Similarly, for emotional abuse, we also have the avenue of filing a domestic violence complaint with the family court. But for sexual abuse and for physical abuse occurring in the domestic context, there is an avenue of filing an FIR of domestic violence with the police. How effective it is as a mechanism, we'll be discussing it later. Also, just one point that I'd like to mention here as well. So one, we'll be discussing all the different remedies that are available to victims of domestic violence in Pakistan. But before that, I also want to highlight that in the Dissolution of Muslim Marriages Act 1939, cruelty in the context of marriage, cruelty in the context of family law has been postulated as a ground for dissolution of marriage. So if you are a victim of domestic violence, if you're a victim of any sort of physical or emotional or sexual or economic abuse, then you can apply for dissolution of marriage on the basis of cruelty as well. So I just gave a comprehensive view of what the Domestic Violence Act is here. We have, of course, the penalties and the different mechanisms that are available for protection, which I'll be discussing later. So for now, I think that's it.
No, I think it's interesting because I think with the essence of the law, it's pretty similar, the UK framework and the Pakistani framework. I do understand with my experience as well that there are differences in the way that it's implemented in the UK and in Pakistan as well. But in terms of the remedies available, could you, Hania, go ahead and maybe talk a little bit about if there's a situation where a woman is impacted by domestic violence, what is the immediate procedure that she has to go through?
All right. So it depends on what sort of abuse. As I highlighted, that there are various forms of abuse that are recognized under the Domestic Violence Act. So if you've undergone physical abuse, then it is very necessary for you to retain as much evidence, either in form of photographs or videos or whatever of your abuse, and then get a medical done, which is basically done at a hospital, which is an MLC. You get an MLC which highlights what exactly are the bruises, what is your medical condition, etc. So it's better to get an MLC. If physical abuse has been inflicted, then the remedy is to file an FIR with the police. And different, so if you've been assaulted, there's a separate section in the Pakistan Penal Code that deals with assault, so you can file an FIR for assault. Now, that is one criminal remedy that you have, that is consulting the police and then following the criminal procedure, that is then the complaint is taken up and the trial starts, etc. And then the punishments are also similar as given in the Pakistan Penal Code. But if you've gone through psychological or emotional abuse, economic abuse in the course of a marriage, then the option is that you file a complaint or you file a domestic violence case in the family court. They're the sort of remedies that are available to you. And even if you've gone through physical abuse and the physical abuse has not left any mark, or the physical abuse is not something that is that can count as cognizable offense, then it is best to go for a complaint of domestic violence in the family court. The family court can give, you can either seek a protection order, that is, the court can restrict the perpetrator from coming near you, be it in your workplace, or they could be, it is similar to like a restraining order where you get certain sort of protection that the perpetrator cannot approach you or be in close proximity to protect you from a future infliction of the same sort of harm. Now, there's another remedy, that is monetary order. You can get certain sort of monetary compensation for all that has been inflicted on you. And the third is a residence order. Residence order is that because in domestic violence, we usually see that domestic violence occurs in the context of marriage or in the context of husband and wife. So the husband is inflicting violence on the wife. The wife, if she files a domestic violence complaint, she has nowhere to go. So yes, we do have Darul Amans and protection centers, but how effective they are, it is something that our legislators also recognize, and that is why we have a provision for a residence order in which the court asks the perpetrator, who is the husband, to leave the premises, and the residence is given to the wife. Now, how effective this is, or how frequently our courts are giving residence orders, protection orders, that is something that we'll be discussing. I also have an interesting remark that an M&A in the National Assembly. He made an interesting remark about the Domestic Violence Act when it was passed in Punjab. So we'll be discussing that as well in the course of this webinar, of course.
I think it's interesting you brought up that that victims can claim financial remedies. Nailah, I'd really like you to talk about whether that's something that's happening in the UK as well. I do understand there's non-molestation orders and occupation orders, which do the job of restraining orders and residence orders. But what about financial remedies? Is that something that is present in the UK framework?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's interesting to hear that perspective from Hania. And as I was listening to her, I was sort of thinking about the similarities. And the equally, of course, in the United Kingdom or England and Wales, where I practice, there are options. In terms of domestic violence, again, it depends on the nature of what is happening. If the situation, can you still hear me clearly, Mahpara? Thank you. Obviously, if the situation is urgent, if it's an emergency, the first port of call always has to be the police. And I touched on that earlier on. That obviously can potentially lead to a situation where the alleged perpetrator is charged. And then obviously the criminal proceedings will deal with that. It's interesting to mention also, if there is a conviction, we actually have a scheme in the United Kingdom where it's called the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme. So if there is a conviction, the victim can actually get financial compensation from the government. It's something which is not, I would say, overtly sort of promoted, if that's the right word, but certainly it does exist, and that is one option to victims. Also, coming back to the context of the family proceeding, depending upon the nature of the relationship, for example, if it is a husband and wife situation, you can, of course, issue divorce proceedings if that is what the client wants to do. As part of that, you can then look at financial remedies. Even if you're not married, there may be joint assets which need resolving. And again, that would be a civil application. We also have the child maintenance service, which sorts out the maintenance side. Typically, it is mothers who make the application because they are the ones with whom the child or children are living. So those options are available. It was also interesting for me to hear that Hania used the word residence order. And I think that was in the context of, I think that, to me, if my understanding is correct, is parallel to what I was talking earlier on about in terms of an occupation order. So where one person is removed from the property, or where a certain part of the property is exclusively for the purposes of the applicant. So that was interesting. But I say it was interesting because we actually use the residence order in old money in England and Wales to deal with the children arrangements, actually. So it was interesting to see that that's actually being used in a different sort of way. Of course, Mahpara, as you will know, now the arrangements for the children are called child arrangements orders. So residence order and contact order is the old money, if you were. So now they are encapsulated by way of child arrangements order, and that can include the living arrangements as well as the spending time arrangements. I think in terms of this question, I did relate this to when I first spoke about question number 2. So the mechanisms and the protections which I touched on would be available.
Right. I think so. As Hania talked about the Pakistani domestic violence framework and how it covers the household entirely. Of course, in practice, we see more women and wives being impacted by it. But as far as the context of the law goes, I'm assuming there are, in certain situations, children impacted by domestic violence law as well. Is that something that you see in the UK, Nailah, or not frequently?
Yes, most certainly. I mean, as I said at the outset, I'm currently working for a children's charity now where I don't represent parents anymore. I only represent children in private law proceedings. Now, for the purposes of the audience of this webinar, in England and Wales, generally speaking, when a mother or a father makes an application, the child is not usually made a party to the case. It is just the mother. For example, if it is a father's application, and then the mother would be the respondent. But in certain cases, where the criteria is met for what we call a rule herself is made a party to the proceedings, and that is the nature of the work which I do. So my client is technically the child. I take instructions from a social worker, and who then gives independent recommendations to the court about what is in the child's best interests in terms of the living arrangements or whatever the application is before the court. Because as you will know, Mahpara, the applications can be quite varied. For example, parents may not agree on a school, for example, which would be a specific issue. For example, there may be a prohibited steps order application if one party is saying that the child cannot travel with mother to Pakistan, for example. So there's lots of different scenarios. And going back to answering your question, domestic violence, yes, unfortunately, it is a feature of a lot of the cases that I deal with at NYAS. And even before life in NYAS, when I was representing parents, unfortunately, it is a feature of these cases. And the impact, I know we're going to be going to talk about the impact a bit later on, but it is damaging, clearly, and it's everlasting. And sometimes it takes people a lifetime to recover from these sorts of experiences.
No, that's completely understandable, and I completely agree. I think it ruins the fabric of the society on its own as well. What do you think now? I understanding that Hania is talking from a perspective of a Muslim country, and a lot of our laws are influenced by that religious sentiment and that cultural sentiment. Hania, how do you think domestic violence laws, specifically with relevance to implementation, how do you think are they impacted by that religious or cultural sentiment?
Mahpara, unfortunately, there is a misinterpretation of both our religion and even I would say misinterpretation of even our culture when it comes to the implementation. So domestic relations, especially that of a husband and wife, are based on love, mutual respect, and this is what is enshrined in our religion as well. But since the man has been given the status of a kawam or a protector of a woman in Surah Nisa, that is misinterpreted, and it is widely believed by people here in Pakistan that a man has been authorized to inflict violence on his wife as long as he believes that she is disobeying her. So this issue, this misconception, is so prevalent in Pakistan that people do not think of domestic violence in the context of husband and wife as an actual issue. So when we approach the police for FIRs, we have clients who have been brutally injured by their intimate partners or their husbands here in Pakistan. The police refuses to register an FIR. The police is very clear that this is a domestic issue, this is very common, and that it should be resolved by both partners, and this issue should not be brought before the police. If the IO, if the investigating officer is kind enough, he would agree to become a mediator in the issue. But straight out, a woman finds it extremely difficult in Pakistan, even if she has legal support, to go to a police station and get an FIR registered for domestic violence. The police has the same view. If we look at the family courts, up to the session court, the view is the same, that domestic violence, although family courts have been authorized, we can file complaints of domestic violence in the family court, but the behavior of the judges, but the way they're approaching cases of domestic violence shows deep-rooted stereotypes and misinformed religious opinions. So that is a significant issue we do face when it comes to taking up cases of domestic violence and providing legal aid and assistance to victims and survivors of domestic violence. I also believe that in the context of dissolution of marriage, there, if you claim that you've been a victim of physical abuse, emotional abuse, in that context, dissolution of Muslim marriages is very easy if you're able to prove that you've been a victim of abuse. So getting dissolution on the basis of abuse is not difficult in Pakistan, but getting a separate case filed for domestic violence with the police or even in the court, it is difficult. If we look at the implementation challenges of the Domestic Violence Act here in Punjab, the Act was not notified till November. So the Act was, in Punjab, the Act came in 2016, and till last November 2023, the law was not notified. So it shows that there's also a hindrance, or there's a lack of willingness on part of the executive to actually enforce this law as well. I was earlier speaking about this little quip that an MNA made standing on the floor of the parliament. So this law, when it was promulgated in Punjab, an MNA from Punjab went and stood up on the floor of the National Assembly, and there he made an interesting remark, and he said that in Punjab, a husband for just giving a light beating to his wife can be put in fetters. So इससे बड़ी नाइंसाफी क्या हो सकती है, that what could be more unfair that a man, just because he has given a light beating to his wife, is being put in fetters. So that shows the insensitivity and the fact that there's an accepted cultural norm that husbands do beat their wives. This is an unfortunate and grim reality of our society, but we do see that the police now is taking different initiatives. In Punjab, we have the virtual woman police station that has been started very recently to address issues specific to women in the context of domestic equations. We also have the Hafuz Marakis that are being started in Sindh. I see that different police and police centers have been specifically designated to address issues of women and children. I also believe that such initiatives, if they are started with the right intent, they can challenge the accepted cultural position of domestic violence being a ghar ka masla or a domestic problem, and that everybody goes through it. So this can be challenged with the right intent.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hania. Well, that's quite unfortunate that our society is going through that. Nailah, do you feel like you see that apprehension or those stereotypes in the UK as well? Or do you feel like there's a certain demographic that is particularly influenced by that kind of a thought process?
Thank you, Mahpara. Just before I forget, because I'd like to touch on some of the comments which Hania has made before I go into my answer. And it is quite disheartening and quite sad, really, to hear that we're living in a modern era, and these things are still happening at a global level, where there is this misinterpretation of culture and almost a toxic misinterpretation of the religion. In fact, it is being used, it's being manipulated to people's own advantages. So that is quite disheartening to hear. I think it's also important to point out, at least if my figures are correct, the 2021 consensus, 2021 census survey that we have in the UK and England and Wales, according to that, there's just under 4 million Muslims living in the United Kingdom. So it's also important. I raise that because this is a global sort of feature, and I see this quite often when I was representing wives or husbands or mothers and fathers before, especially from South Asian backgrounds, from Pakistan or India. Unfortunately, this way of thinking is prevalent in these cultures, and I think this is something which needs to be addressed and rooted. And of course, education is at the core of this. So it's not necessarily because a Muslim or a Pakistani family is living in England, for example, and we don't see these things. It's actually the total opposite. We do see these things, and these things are happening even in a modern society such as England and Wales. Now, before I think you have one hand up, Mahpara. I don't know if you want to deal with that before I carry on with my response.
Yeah, I think we're just going to take some questions in the chat for people watching. But you can
That's
go
fine.
ahead.
I'll carry on. I'll carry on in that sense. In terms of addressing this question about cultural and religion influences shaping the interpretation and enforcement of family law related to gender-based violence in England, the dominant faith in England, of course, has been and remains Christianity. That being said, of course, England and Wales, it's a multicultural society. We have people of different faiths, different backgrounds living here. And I think it's also fair to say that whilst historically there has been without doubt a strong interplay between law and religion, we only have to look as far back as 1992, which isn't particularly long period away, when marital rape was ultimately criminalized. Prior to that, the long-standing position from the Victorian period was that the wife had always been given presumed consent for intercourse throughout the marriage as part of the sacred marriage vows. So that is one example of where religion or culture, as it were, impacted on that. And fortunately, we are now a long way from that. We have moved on in a positive way. And I think it's fair to say that in the modern times, we're now operating in England or UK, if it were, as a secular society in the legal context. So of course, the religion is there, but in the legal context, the impact of culture and religion, in my view, is not, well, it's not really there. It's virtually non-existent. And again, just going back, because I know this discussion is about the parallel and the comparisons between the two different countries, but my experiences and understanding of family law in Pakistan is unfortunately limited. But what I do know is that from an Islamic perspective, there's no difference between the sacred and the secular. And just to explain that for the purposes of some of the audience who may not be clear as to what I mean, for example, the Islamic rules would govern the prayers that we do on a daily basis, but that is something which is sacred. But the secular, in terms of your relationship with your husband or your financial provision or anything like that, which would be considered as secular perhaps in some societies, that's not the case. And I know Hania touched on this, and in terms of the religious impact and the principles, even though of course they have been misinterpreted in many ways and on many occasions, but the impact, the comparison is different. We don't really have that here in England. And of course, I know we've sort of touched on this webinar in terms of that in a negative way. It can be positive as well. In my opinion, like I say, my experience and knowledge is limited. And for that reason, I can't go into any great detail about this. But for example, in the context of a marriage where a husband has to give a monetary gift to the woman, for example, a wife at the beginning of the marriage, the financial provision, whether he does that or he doesn't, you know, the Islamic principles are there. So this can also be seen in a positive light. And I think I want this to come across in this webinar. It's not all negative, but unfortunately, as Hania touched, it's about the interpretation. And when you are living in a male-dominated society, when your politicians are largely male, when your judiciary is largely male, and going back to the comments which Hania said the MLA made in that National Assembly, it's that sort of thinking which, you know, ends up in these sorts of results and experiences for people. And that is unfortunate, like I said, in the modern times that we are now living in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I'm just going to check the chat box. So we have one of our viewers, Faraz Ahmed Khan. I think he's asking, what are the long-term effects of domestic violence and how does it last? How does it have a lasting impact on the upbringing of a child? Nailah, would you want to go ahead with that?
Shall we come back to that, Mahpara? Because I'm just conscious of you've got an agenda with your meeting. And one of the points that we are going to look at is impact. So I do have an answer for that, but I'm just conscious if we perhaps follow the agenda and then we address that question shortly, if that's all right.
I think I was coming to that question anyway now. So I think maybe we can just integrate.
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm just going to go down on my because it's a bit further down on my list. Just bear with me. Here we are. I'm nearly there now. So I think this was sorry, just bear with me while I get this up. I think this was point number 7 on your list of the agenda, Mahpara.
Yeah,
and the point there was, given your expertise in children's law and domestic violence, how do gender-based violence cases within families impact on children differently in the UK and Pakistan, and how do the laws in each country address these impacts? Well, the main legislation governing children law in England and Wales is the Children Act 1989 as amended. As per section 1 of that legislation, when a court determines any question with respect to a child's upbringing, and this obviously naturally includes child arrangements, i.e. where a child is to live and where a child is to spend time with the other parent, and if so, the form, duration, frequency of the same, etc. I say that because this is one of the main examples, one of the main sort of substantive applications that the court usually has before it. So when the court is looking at this, the child's welfare is the court's paramount consideration. So that takes precedence over everything, essentially. That is the starting point. And as you go through the litigation, that is always going to be your point of reference, whether the child's welfare is being protected, because that has to be the court's paramount consideration, and whether whatever is happening is in the child's best interests. Now, as part of children cases, whether private law, and by that I mean, and I'm only clarifying because I'm conscious of the different jurisdictions we're discussing. So private law children in the context of England and Wales is disputes between parents, and public law children is where the local authority is involved in terms of the local authority making an application to remove a child usually. Now, whether it's private or public, detailed assessments are usually undertaken by experienced professionals. They include independent social workers, they can include psychologists who determine risk and the impact of the risk and the impact of what has happened before in the parties' relationship to assess basically what the recommendations should be before the court in terms of the best recommendations for the child. Now, based on those, quite often in the cases I deal with, especially from the perspective of a psychologist, therapeutic interventions are identified. Now, the fact that therapy is being identified, is an alarm bell and sort of addresses this question in the first instance, because what is the impact? Well, the impact is damaging emotionally. Now, I'm not an expert psychologist, so I can't go into any details about that. But the emotional impact is there. Quite often, the assessments conclude that a child has been through trauma. There can be post-traumatic stress disorders typically it is ladies who we see these in. Now, when these things are being looked at, the assessments can come back with various recommendations for therapy. It can be counselling, it can be art therapy, different types of therapy. Now, whilst the court cannot make any orders in relation to therapy, and the reason for that is because of the issues of enforcement and funding, essentially, because in essence, it's down to the relevant party. And if it's a child, it is down to the parent for them to go and access this therapy for their child. But even though this can't be directed in that sense, it has to be recorded in any final order that the court's expectations are. And this is something which I'm conscious about when I deal with these cases. The expectation is that the therapy will be sought out and will address whatever the issues are for this child. I think also to address this question, we also have to consider the impact in terms of what child arrangements order is going to be given. Now, I say that because it's not necessarily the case that, for example, if a father has applied for contact, he will necessarily get contact. Each case is very different. So if the court decides that contact is not currently in the best interest of a child because that child, for example, needs therapy to address his experiences of domestic violence, then quite often we do see the limited contact. For example, this could include indirect contact until the relevant party, and again, I don't want to stereotype, but it is usually the father, for example, has completed the necessary domestic violence work. This could be a domestic violence perpetrator's cause. It could be something like an anger management cause. So it's not a given that you're going to apply for contact and you're going to get it. It's not as simple as that at all. I hope that addresses the
Yeah, I think it does. But it was very interesting that you brought up therapy, and that's something that, as part of the proceedings, is encouraged. I do understand there's still a stigma associated with mental health help in Pakistan. And so, Hania, do you think if we have a proceeding similar to what Nailah just described, do you think mental health is the kind of action that our authorities go towards?
Absolutely. So, Mahpara, I would like to highlight an instance here. Very recently, I was given the case of a woman who had been undergoing domestic violence. Sorry, am I audible? Okay, perfect. So she had been undergoing domestic violence throughout the course of a 15-year-long marriage. She had 2 daughters from that marriage. And that person, the perpetrator here, who was the husband, he was undergoing some psychological problems. Were there psychological problems? Yes, he got a diagnosis from the medical health institution of Lahore, the mental health institution of Lahore. But that person was also molesting his daughter. There are multiple instances where such people in domestic context, the perpetrators in domestic context, are not just inflicting violence on their spouses or on their wives. They're also being extremely brutal towards their children. So if you've undergone childhood trauma, absolutely, there's mental assistance that is needed. So if you've been going through this for an extended period of time, there's a likelihood that this is going to scar you for the rest of your life, and there is going to be a trauma that will be attached to it. Our law, unfortunately, does not address this. This is a lacuna in our Domestic Violence Act. There are only 3 times the term children has been mentioned in the Domestic Violence Act. That is only in the context of domestic violence. So the law does recognize that domestic violence can occur against children as well. But are there enough remedies for children? No. So the law has been drafted keeping the wife in view. Although it does say that the law caters to children, but a child cannot go to a court and seek a protection order or a monetary order or even a residence order. And just like Nailah was mentioning, there are a lot of avenues for children's legal assistance in the UK. In Pakistan, we do not have this concept. It is at least not very prevalent. So, of course, this is a lacuna in the law that mental health assistance is not recognized. There's no recognition of this, and especially because a taboo is attached with seeking mental assistance, there is difficulty in inserting provisions related to mental health in this law as well. But I would also like to mention here that when I was given that case, the first thing that crossed my mind was that the child who has been molested, who is going through this, she needs psychological help. So when I brought this up with the mother, who's the client in our case, she blatantly refused. And she said, no, this cannot be done. I understand that my child has gone through a lot, but my child would be sleeping when the husband would be inflicting this sort of sexual abuse on the child. So I don't think my child would remember. And my instant response to that was that it is your misconception that your child has not properly understood what has been happening to them. So mental health problems do occur. Domestic violence not only harms the woman, the wife who is undergoing this, but the children also go through a lot of trauma when they see this happening at their home. And it is absolutely imperative for them to be given counseling, therapy. But mental health assistance is something that is more or less a taboo in Pakistani society that definitely more people need to work on. Definitely we need more conversations around it, and even amendments in our law to actually cater to this lacuna that yes, people who go through violence, who go through traumatic events, they would need some sort of mental health assistance because that is impacting them in various ways, in more than one way. So if you do not have any scars, there's more definitely something that that is not visible, but it is happening or it has happened to you. So I would say that yes, this is a very, very important issue, but does this issue have recognition? No, there's no recognition for mental health assistance in the Domestic Violence Act. And third, there's a lot of reluctance or inertia from the parties as well. So if I work with an organization that can actually provide psychological assistance to victims, people would still not come. We say, okay, we're providing a safe environment. Maybe you could bring your children. Maybe you could come yourself. There's a lot of reluctance when it comes to this. That is an unfortunate thing.
Yeah, I was actually going to come to that to explore whether clients are willing to take that up. But you answered it on your own that it's something that you've noticed resistance from your clients as well, whether when taking mental health help. And I think that brings me to the question of whether there's anything that you think, Hania, the Pakistani domestic violence legal framework could benefit from having taken maybe some inspiration from the UK legal framework.
So first thing that I've pointed out already, that is the lacuna when it comes to proper remedies for psychological abuse. So just getting a protection order, residence order, or a monetary order is not going to be enough. There's something more that needs to be done. So yes, there has to be recognition that that there should be a psychological assessment of domestic violence victims and the children as well, who have seen this at a very, very tender age, at a young age, or even in their teens if they're seeing it. So there should be an assessment to see what sort of psychological harm has been inflicted on the victims, not just the main person who is the victim, but also the secondary victims who are vicariously going through that abuse. Second thing that I believe in Pakistan, a lot of victims shy away from filing domestic violence complaints because of financial constraints, because of the lack of support from their families. So yes, if a person files a domestic violence complaint, their initial thought is going to be, okay, I have to leave this person now. We say, no, you do not have to leave the person. Can you live with the same person? Yes, you can live with the same person, but is there going to be any guarantee that they'll not be inflicting the same sort of violence? So we don't have any guarantee. That means that it is very, very important for you to move out of those premises. Residence orders are not given very frequently in Pakistan. We have barely any instance in Punjab where any family court gave a residence order, although we do have a law on this. So then, because of financial constraints, women face difficulties moving out of those premises, and that is because they do not have anywhere to go. The families, if they go back to their houses, to their families, they would most definitely press them for reconciliation. Therefore, we need to have some sort of fund, some sort of assistance that needs to be established by the government that can help these women, give them some sort of protection, shelters, etc. We do have Darul Aman here, we do have some women protection centers, but how they have been notified on paper, the women protection centers, but have they been created? No. And there's a lot of public interest litigation going on in Sindh, I believe. In Punjab as well, we have public interest litigation in which these women protection centers have to be made effective. Right now, we don't have that. From the UK law, as Nailah was pointing out, that there are instances where the government can fund you actually. We do not have any sort of government source funding available to victims of domestic violence. There's no concept of that. Maybe we could learn from that. And third thing that is very important, that the Domestic Violence Act has been, as I mentioned, it is more from the perspective of a woman who has undergone domestic violence, but the law also needs to pivot towards children, because they're also going through domestic violence. There are many times, many children in Pakistan, male and female, who undergo massive abuse in their homes that really scars them for the rest of their life. We do not have legal assistance, or we do not have legal mechanisms to protect children in the context of domestic violence. So this is one very important takeaway I have from the UK legislation, that they are prioritizing the best interest of the child. Here, we do not have that much focus towards children. As I mentioned, the Domestic Violence Act mentions children only 3 times in the entire law. Fourth thing that I believe, in UK, we do not have stereotypes, or we do not have this sort of reluctance by the police or by the judges to actually take up these cases. In Pakistan, there is need for a behavioral shift as well. A major shift needs to be done in the behavior of officers, in the behavior of judges. They refuse to recognize this as an issue. So maybe we could learn from them on this aspect as well, that this is actually a cognizable offense. This is actually a problem. This is actually a violence in itself, and it needs to be taken as any other offense or as any other crime.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And talking further about your point about public interest litigation in Sindh as well, Adil or Sahid actually brought up a public interest litigation for the implementation of domestic violence laws as well, because the framework clearly states there has to be service providers, mental health assistants, who are actually trained. Magistrates need to be sensitized according to how to handle a domestic violence victim when they come to court. There have to be centers arranged for for the victims to be able to go somewhere. None of that has clearly happened in Sindh either, which is why the public interest litigation had become our main agenda for Adil Sehat as well, which we're still working on. It is quite a hike in Pakistan. I completely agree with you, Hania, and I completely agree with all the takeaways that you pointed out as well. And I do understand from what you said that the inability of implementation is largely drawn from the lack of financial literacy that a lot of the women have as well in Pakistan. Nailah, I'd just like to get your opinion on whether that financial literacy part, is that something that creates a hindrance in the UK as well, or you don't think that's contributing to the problem?
I think it definitely can do. I mean, although obviously, Mahpara, as you know from your experiences here, legal aid is available, but it is, of course, means and merits tested. Now, the merits are not usually a problem because a solicitor is only going to apply for legal aid or for an application to the court if there's merit in an argument to be presented to the court in terms of resolving that dispute. But the issue sometimes can be means. So if you are, for example, there's different thresholds, and if you are over the threshold, then you cannot access legal aid. Also, a couple of years ago, they changed the rules whereby now you have to have evidence of domestic abuse. And I was going to address this in one of the other areas, which is like an overlap now in terms of the challenges. And if you don't have evidence of the domestic abuse, and not everybody does, Because even in England and Wales, not everybody, and again, typically, don't want to stereotype, but it is the women typically, they will not necessarily have made a report to the police for whatever reason. It could be for fear, it could be because they do not have anywhere to go, because they feel stuck, because they're not mentally prepared to take that step. A number of reasons, really. Could be cultural factors as well, especially when I deal with a lot of South Asian clients, ladies who I dealt with previously, because they want their marriage to work. And this is what we are taught in our culture. And, you know, your marriage has to work. It's the be all and the end all. So again, this comes back to the issue of sort of really educating from really sort of school level onwards, because this is where the education starts for a child. So if you are starting from these sorts of premises, then it is going to be difficult to change these views as you're going forward, because they're only going to become more entrenched. So this is why education is so important. But yes, absolutely, we do have those challenges, because coming back to your question, if you cannot provide the evidence of the domestic abuse for whatever reason, then you're not going to get legal aid. And you may not necessarily have the money to pursue the litigation by yourself. Now, I've recently started working with another charity called Rights of Women. We don't represent ladies in court, but what we do offer is free advice over the telephone. And that is usually done in the evenings. So we have like a rota for the solicitors. Obviously, we don't get paid for that because it's pro bono, it's voluntary work. So there are support services in that sense available. I think, touching from what Hania said, we also perhaps are lucky in that we do have funding from governments for certain charities who do support victims of domestic abuse, whether male or female. So there is that option available, but I often see in some of the cases, especially now that I'm representing children, a lot of the time the parents, whether male, whether fathers or mothers, a lot of them are not represented because of financial reasons, no doubt, and they are clearly at a litigation disadvantage because of that. And this is one of the reasons why the Domestic Abuse Act brought in the prohibition, which I touched on earlier on, in terms of a perpetrator no longer being able to cross-examine a victim of domestic abuse, because that's clearly unfair. If you have gone through such an experience, which can be traumatic, and then not only for you to tell your story to the court, but you are going to be cross-examined by the person who has done this to you, that's defeating the object of justice. So that is one of the changes which obviously the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 brought in and made sort of progression in that. It was also interesting. Again, I'm conscious that this is a sort of a comparison sort of discussion, and it was interesting to hear Hania say that the children are referred to, I think she said, only 3 times in the relevant legislation. I think it's a lot different here, because obviously we've had sort of, you know, legislation protecting children from a long time. But it may surprise some people to hear this, but it was only until the 2021 Act when children are actually now recognized as victims of domestic abuse in their own right. So if you have been in a domestic setting and you have witnessed domestic abuse, whether or not it has been inflicted on you is not relevant. If you have been exposed to it, you have witnessed it somehow, then you are now recognized as a victim in your own right. And the family court has to take this into account when determining the application.
That's interesting. And I'm happy to hear that children were included. But again, I wasn't aware that they weren't as part of the domestic violence law before 2021. Because in my understanding in Sindh, it's been like that, and children have been under the domestic violence, have been considered under the domestic violence law since the act came in 2013. I think I'm going to have to skip through question 9 because of time constraints, and just wrap this up. But before we do, I'd really like to hear if there are any particular changes in law that you both are looking forward to, or if you think there's any next steps, particularly which could be taken in context of your of your jurisdiction, but also the cultural influences that are present there. What are you looking forward to? Hania, why don't you go first?
So the first thing that I'm really looking forward to is the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act now that it has been notified in Punjab, but the implementation bit is lacking. The government has not allocated funds for the establishment of protection centers as has been postulated in the law. So there definitely needs to be better implementation of the Domestic Violence Act. Apart from that, there's a lot on the level of sensitization, on the level of building capacity building of people like judges, magistrates, family court judges, police officials who are going to deal with cases of domestic violence. So we see that there's a lot of insensitivity, and that insensitivity is not coming because of some professional problems or some deficiency in the law. That insensitivity is coming from the culture they've been raised in. So whatever we see in society is also reflecting in these officials. What we need to actually focus on right now is the sensitization of these officials. There need to be trainings. There has to be a lot of effort that needs to be placed, that needs to be put in, so that we train these officials on the lines of best international practices. So when we see a change in the behavior, when we do the capacity building training of these officials, we'll definitely see a change in the behavior. And once that is more sensitive towards victims of domestic violence, there definitely is going to be improvement in terms of accessibility of victims of domestic violence, in terms of like legal assistance, and also in terms of convictions, we're also going to see an improvement. But that all depends on capacity building and improvement in behavior of the first responders to domestic violence.
Yeah, I completely agree. Nailah, what do you think?
Thank you, Mahpara. I'm conscious of the time. I know we're coming to an end, so I'm going to keep it as short as possible. I think in the context of children work, which is obviously what I do, one of the main potential reforms which is happening at the moment is being piloted across different family courts is the Pathfinder. So this will essentially operate a more streamlined and focused process whereby information is gathered, hopefully much earlier on, by CAFCAS. CAFCAS stands for the Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service. It's the organization that provides independent recommendations to the court in private law disputes usually. So the information gathering will include early obtaining of disclosure in relation to domestic violence, which is why I'm raising this as a point here, including police disclosure or any information from DV organizations. And this will not only save on court time, but hopefully it will also be a less stressful time for an experience for victims of domestic abuse, because CAFCAS will be able to provide a more detailed initial view compared to what is currently happening, whereby they sort of provide an initial safeguarding letter and then conduct a more initial in-depth analysis later on. So it will be the other way around now, in a way, if you like. They are supposed to be completing a child impact assessment on the basis of all of this information which is being gathered at a more earlier stage. And this should reduce the litigation period as well.
Well, that's great and sounds quite useful. I just really like to thank you both for being here. I'm really grateful that we could have this discussion, and I hope that it's helped many people and made them more aware of their rights as well. I've taken we'll just, I'm sorry, I'm going a little over time, but we have a question from, and if you're both okay with just extending for 5 minutes, maybe
It's
we
fine. I'm absolutely fine with that.
All right, great. So we have a question from Fatma, and she's saying, how do you think, when you speak of training, how do you think this can be provided to these individuals? Because it's worth taking into account that it's provided by people who recognize accounts of these victims. How can you negate the biases and pressures from society and relations of external families? I think, yeah, I think you should both have a go at answering that, because I feel like the answer might vary considering there's different cultural contexts to it.
I'll go first, Mahpara,
Yeah,
if
sure.
that's okay. Only because I touched on this shortly before.
Yeah.
I think for me the main sort of area of knowledge or education is usually at the start, and I'm not sure, again, because of my lack of knowledge of how things operate in Pakistan. But I think what is needed is education about women's rights from a very early stage, from school. really, because that's where you're being informed of this. Now that's difficult because because I know that Pakistan, including a lot of other countries, not everybody has the privilege of education, and this is the other sort of issue that we have. I mean, my family comes from Azad Kashmir, and I certainly, when I go back, home every couple of years, it's not the case that every young girl there is having access to education because people can't afford it. So this then brings on to perhaps what Hania was saying about organizations being funded by the government to go out and educate women on the real ground when these things are actually happening. Not just the cities, but the rural areas as well. I think this is important.
Hania, would you like to add something?
So I would answer this on two levels. The first thing that Fatma is speaking about is how women who are facing so much societal pressure, how will they come out and speak? That is definitely an issue. A lot of women undergo violence their entire lives, and they never speak about it just because they want to preserve the family. They do not want to jeopardize their marriage or the familial relation. So that is definitely one issue that we're facing. Greater legal awareness, more accessible legal aid can help improve behaviors, can help improve the society's view of the Domestic Violence Act. See, when you're pursuing a complaint against the when you're pursuing a complaint under the Domestic Violence Act, you're not applying for khula. The person will face the consequences and the marriage will stay intact. So we're not necessarily challenging the marriage in the domestic violence context. So this is something that people need to know about. That person will just be punished for their conduct. Again, at the same time, will the marriage survive is a question that, it is going to vary from family to family. Second, I spoke about the training of officials. So we have investigating officers who do not know what the domestic violence law says. We even have magistrates who are unaware of what the domestic violence law is. That is why they do not understand what the law is, and they would never cater to your applications. No matter what you're pleading, they won't even know what you're pleading. So when magistrates, investigating officers are trained, and this training has to be done by professionals who are already working in this field, NGOs who can, teach them international best standards. When this sort of training takes place, when these officials are trained to keep aside their biases, to keep aside their accepted views, and go ahead and pursue what is written in the law, then definitely there's going to be a change. And as far as the judiciary is concerned, we need to see better convictions in cases of domestic violence. So once the conviction rate improves, there's definitely going to be faith in the judicial process. A lot of people do not have any faith in the judicial process, and that is because there are going to be delays. The litigation process is going to be very lengthy, and there's going to be no outcome of it. When the outcome and the duration is improved, it is more victim-centric, it is more victim-friendly, then definitely the faith in the judiciary will be restored, and more women will start coming out. At the same time, legal awareness and legal aid, when they become more accessible to clients, then more women would actually be pursuing their cases. And awareness is going to actually change the dynamics of our societal fabric that currently really discourages women from coming out and speaking about their domestic violence experiences.
Thank you, Hania. Unfortunately, there's a couple of more things I think that we have in the chat box, but unfortunately, we won't be able to cover those in this session. But for everyone viewing, we do have a lot of plans for further sessions and webinars too. And hopefully, if we have Nailah free in the forthcoming days, we can arrange another one as well. I really hope that I really wish the both of you best of luck for your future endeavors, and I was really happy to hear all the work that the both of you have done with respect to domestic violence and also abuse against children. Thank you for joining, and thank you for giving us your perspective in it. I really hope that our viewers benefit from whatever we've discussed and talked about, and hopefully I would just really like to ask everyone to stay tuned to Mehfooz, because we have a lot of future plans as well, talking about different areas of gender-based violence and domestic violence. And for more such content, I think just follow us and keep in the loop. Thank you so much again to both of you. I'm very grateful that you both are here and you joined the session. And I'm sure that it was incredible for everyone to watch as well.
Thank you, Mahpara. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.